All right, hey everybody. Thanks for tuning in to this week's Hack and Play, where I'm going to be going through Tugboat QA. And Tugboat is also a sponsor of this episode. So shout out to them. So if you're not familiar with Tugboat, I should actually open their main website instead of just their docs, so that way we can teach you a bit more about what Tugboat is. So Tugboat lets you provide instant previews for your code environment. So if you're making a pull request, you can have an environment to test something out on. Or let's say you don't necessarily have a code change, but you just need to create like an ephemeral environment that is temporary, but you don't want to like pay a platform as a service that's hosting your Drupal site $5,000 just to have a temporary environment. So this way you can just say, hey, Tugboat, I need this environment. Can you spin me one up? And that's where you can test out some kind of like site building and configuration. And I primarily work with this through, I'm used to using preview environments through platform.sh, where they create an environment for each branch. In Pantheon, they call it multi-dev. This is actually a nice hosting agnostic way of having preview environments. I don't like merging code to dev without it being tested. I think that once you test something, you should just ship it out to production immediately. And it's really hard to do that if you don't have testing environments. So that's where Tugboat is invaluable. I use it on my clients. I create a pull request, or my team does. I send it to the client. I'm like, hey, does this sound good? They click on it. They give feedback on the user interface. We merge it. We ship it out to production. So it helps lower the feedback loop cycle and just lets you be more productive and have higher velocity. And you manage it much the same way as you would your regular continuous integration. So if you have Circle CI, GitHub Actions, Travis, GitLab, however, it's the same kind of concept. It's not the exact same because it has its own abstractions, and we'll go through those throughout this workflow. I just wanted to quick point out that it is super affordable. There is a free tier, which is pretty gracious. I don't know if they have the exact like previews here, but I use a intro plan for work at Bluehorn Digital has an intro plan in all of our customers. It just makes it faster. We get faster builds, and time is money. So we're willing to pay money to have more time. But like the demo we go through today will all be on the free tier. And as far as I know, there's no real limitations on anything except for speed. You basically pay to have access to faster builds. So we'll go through kind of configuring Tugboat. We'll be going through, I made a examples repo that will be available for folks to look through. That's on the Bluehorn Digital GitHub. I'll share this out, but Tugboat examples. Instead of making 5 different repositories for this, I actually created different branches, and we'll be deploying previews for each branch. I have a decoupled Drupal example. I have a Drupal example that has Solr and Redis. And then I also have a Laravel example, and we'll add Redis connections to Laravel. Some of this you'll have to take with a grain of salt because it's not like a live project. I couldn't share any of my client work for that, but it should be a pretty good example. We'll be creating environments using their API, which is exactly how the simplytest.me project works. And for those who aren't familiar with simplytest.me, actually, this is the beta site. I'll go to the regular site. So it is a way to evaluate Drupal projects online. If you go into here, I'm not going to launch a project, but you're actually able to pick different Drupal projects, launch a sandbox, and at the end, you get a Tugboat website. A Drupal site that's hosted on Tugboat. I'm pretty sure that they're also supporting build previews for all of Drupal core now. So I really like Tugboat. It makes me work faster. They're out of the Lullabot team. A lot of them are bots, and I think the company is still pretty close together, although they're 2 separate entities. So I think if we go to this Olivero issue, actually, we should see that. Oh, it's on a patch, so there's not an example. But let's see real quick if we can find an example. If there was a merge request in any of these, which nobody made a merge request. Oh, there's the live preview. Sorry. So here we go. Can be seen on the live preview here. So actually, Drupal core contributions end up with a backing Tugboat environment for working on things. So now we'll walk through what it's like to build some of that stuff. So we'll get started. There's great documentation at docs.tugboat.qa. If you are curious about the API, you just go to api.tugboat.qa, and it's generated via OpenAPI, so it's top notch. So let's get started. So to go first, I wrote, like I said, I didn't commit any of these changes into my different branches because I wanted to let us experiment a little bit more without making different commits and managing multiple repositories. So using the API, I can actually take a configuration here and paste it into, or post it to Tugboat, and it will create a preview for us. So that's how we're going to go through a few things. We're able to do a post to the preview with our reference, which is the branch, the config file, which is just a JSON format of the YAML file, and the repository that it's pointed to, and get back the builds. And this is exactly how Simply Test leverages Tugboat. Is we do these post commands to the API to build on-demand environments. So let's get started first. Real quick, I wanted to show a really basic Laravel setup, since Laravel is a really straightforward PHP environment. So I'll quick go over to that branch. We go to Laravel. We'll see that it copied over a few branch items, but when you set up a Laravel app, you get your composer.json, which is the Laravel project and the framework, and then you also get a package.json because the front end leverages Mix for the compiled assets. As we can see, not necessarily in there, in the CSS. These are all empty, but it would be able to compile the CSS for you based on the webpack.mix to serve from the different blade routes. So let's go ahead and let's launch an instance of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get that kicked off, and then we'll go through what's inside of the content. So what my little helper command here is doing is just saying that I want to take the Laravel config I have here and deploy it against the Laravel branch. And if I go over to the UI, we'll see here that there is a build going. And while this is building here, and then we can come back to the build preview log, I'll go through the configuration file. Bump up the size of VS Code a little bit so it's easier to read. So when you define a Tugboat YAML, Tugboat config, you define various services. And just like if you're doing Docker Compose, and you name your different services, in this case we have PHP. Tugboat has a series of their own images you're suggested to use because they are set up to work inside their environment properly. So you have Tugboat QA, PHP 7.4, Apache. And if you're curious about what images are available, you go to docs.tugboat.qa reference, and you can look at Tugboat images. And they'll explain why they have their own images, but you can select from the various ones in here. Note, there is no Nginx and PHP FPM setup. It is just because there isn't a, on Docker Hub, there isn't a library Docker image that has that. There is the PHP library image that has PHP FPM or Apache with PHP. And in our case, that is what our tag is using, is their wrapper around the Docker library image for PHP 7.4 Apache. We're highlighting that this is the default service. So if you have multiple services, you need one to be the default, and this is the one that receives incoming traffic by default. So we're setting this as default. We're going to say it depends on MySQL because Laravel is a stateful application. It requires a database to be present in order to work. Inside of it, now, as I said, we're extending an image, the PHP image, which doesn't have Node. So we install Node into our image, so that way we can run npm and yarn. We're going to then say install yarn, because I personally prefer to use yarn over npm for package management, because I feel like it does a better job with lock files. The Tugboat images don't really make much for don't really make assumptions in order to keep the images lightweight and more versatile. So what this means is that you need to write things like A2 enable like Apache 2 enable module rewrite. Now this might seem tedious to have to do so, especially if you have to install opcache instead of typically you would put this inside your Docker file. Tugboat has the concept of pre-built previews. So this init is something that's run whenever a preview is base previews. That's what they're called. You can have base previews that other things build off of. So whenever a preview is first built, this init command is run. Think of this as the init is something that's inside of your Docker file itself when you build the Docker image. So these are things that you would run to have tools inside your Docker image. We're going to enable rewrite. Normally we would install opcache. This is a step that you need to do in all of your projects, is you need to provide a symbolic link to your doc root. So this way you don't need to modify any of the Apache settings. You just say, this is my doc root. And then one thing we do in here is there is a storage directory. We make sure that it's owned by the www user. So that's this init folder. And then there's another one that's called update. So like I said, init, think of it like if you added those commands into the Docker file. And then update is run when you want to ensure that there is state ready for whenever the preview is refreshed. So if you have a base preview or a preview that's been sitting around for a while and it gets rebuilt or refreshed, this update will come in. And we'll go to the docs shortly to read these. And then you finally have your build. And this is the post-processing that happens. Typically, you might have this, if you're doing full Docker deploys, you would still have this in your Docker file. But inside Tugboat, you want to have this be something that is re-executed. So if you have a base preview, such as think of if you're extending Docker files, how you can have Docker, you can have your Docker file copy data from another image as a build step. So whenever a preview is built, these build commands always run. So if you have a base preview that has your database pre-configured and all that, when you create a preview off of that, the build is what executes. So this way you have a faster build process because you have a pre-existing base preview. And inside of here, we copy the .env file from tugboat.env, which sets up our database connection to our MySQL server inside of Tugboat. We run composer install because, again, anytime a preview is built, whether it's a base preview or from a base preview, you always want to install your dependencies. Same here with yarn install. And then we run the artisan key generate and migrations. Now, if you're a Drupal user and watching this, artisan migrate is like running drush updb, and it just performs any schema changes that are required. And we also run yarn run production. I like to do production builds in Tugboat versus dev because it's a preview. A lot of times, I know this is kind of like a mixed bag. Some people like to have a development build in the previews because then you can do debugging on that server. But to me, it's a preview of what will get shipped out to production. Now, your staging server could be that, but I like to catch those bugs before it even hits staging. So I always run production builds in my previews. And then finally, here's our MySQL service. I put notes in here that I want to add a Redis service and have the cache and session drivers use the Redis connection. So real quick, we'll just go back to the docs to kind of go over a few of those again. So you can leverage service commands. And in here, there's tons of docs that will dive more into how all this works. But the idea here, this example sums it up really well. On init, you install your dependencies and link to docroot. An update is when you prepare files or any kind of data. As my knowledge of how Tugboat was born is Lullabot had a lot of customers who have a lot of media assets and large databases and needed preview servers, and it was just like a monstrosity to execute that. So that's where the idea of base previews come in. You create a base preview that has all of your data, and then you keep building off of that, and every now and then you just refresh the base. So that way your one-off builds don't take forever because they can just copy the source data. And we have a question. Do you have init and update for every service or only for the default one? You can actually pick and choose what you want to have. If you have, I'll show in the next example. When I get to the Drupal site, I have more examples in there. So personally, on the Laravel app that Bluehorn Digital manages, we actually have an init step for MySQL, and I'll just pop over to the Drupal site. Wrong one. So in this Drupal site, you'll see that I have an init command. And again, the init is for pulling in remote data or just something that should be cached in it. So for the database, inside the init is when you would download a database dump and then import it, so that way it's part of the snapshot. We have this where I have a weekly, for my project, the Laravel app is on AWS. We have a job that at like Sunday, I think it's like Sunday morning, dumps the database from the managed database server to S3, and then Tugboat knows to pull that S3 file whenever we rebuild our base preview. So we have another script. So we have a script that exports the database to S3, and another script that when that's done, pings Tugboat to refresh our base preview. And that way by Monday, all of our Tugboat previews have a refresh production version of the database that's been sanitized, et cetera, et cetera. So in your service does not need to can have no commands such as Redis or the Laravel MySQL, or can have an init. We could have in here where, let's say your MySQL database, you had, I don't know, you wanted to refresh this with like a stub file that added more schema in between. I'm not sure. But you don't need to have it for every service or any of them. It's just different build steps. And that's where the docs will do a good job explaining all of that. So in here, they actually have it in the update, which means that I might have it in the wrong space for my own project, but it's been working. And let's see, define the default service. The build process explained. So here's where they have really good documentation. So this is for like the init phase should be for your base preview infrastructure. Like I said, this is stuff that normally would be in for sure in your Docker file. So build to generate the actual site, compiling. Oh wait, no, update. Sorry, update to import data or assets into a service. So actually, on all of my examples, I am wrong here. So I should have these in update, and I'm going to quick fix these because, yep, that actually makes a lot of sense. Because if we're refreshing the base, I don't know, maybe I have it correct in my on my client project. Sorry, words were escaping me there. I probably have it right in my client project because it's working. Just fixing it in a few spots. That wasn't the right spot. So update is, so like I said, init is stuff that would go in your Docker file to build like your base dependency and tools. Update phase is when you would download an external database dump, when you would download a like a file archive. So if you want to have images on it, instead of using in Drupal we have file stage proxy, or Laravel I'm sure there's something else, or in everything else there's some other way to possibly reroute a 404 image to somewhere else. when the update command, that's when you would fetch that archive and copy it in. And then the build phase is when you're actually doing like composer install, compiling assets, which is what we do in the Laravel example. So during build is when we run composer install, we run our migrations, our schema updates, and then we compile our front end assets. So if we look here at our build preview, you'll see that we have the site all set up and run. And I can actually click on preview, and we have our Laravel app running. I just did composer create project here, so there's not too much into it. But if we wanted to, so as I said, let's do a clone. Let's do preview settings. So we're going to create a preview setting. Go to preview settings. Preview name is Laravel. We're going to create it as a base preview. And let's make it a branch preview. We only want it to be a base preview against the Laravel branch. Let's do save configuration. And let's see if I can. So if I clone, let's run another command to create a base preview off of that. So if I look at my handy dandy script here, ref branch, let's look at their docs really quick. I'm looking at the previews and resource, so preview, post, create preview. So repo, we have that ref, the get ref, which we have anchor type, base. Here we go. Default is default. Use matching branch and repo. There are multiple matching. Okay, so since we're going to be basing off of the Laravel branch, it should automatically pick up our preview if I create another one, another base preview. I just want to read this real quick. So default, use matching branch and repo, anchored base previews. If there are multiple previews are created, one for each base preview. All right, let's rerun it and see what happens. So I turned the environment I just created into a base preview, and I'm going to run my tool again to create another preview. And it should, okay, great. It was built off of, it should be built off of this previous one. And let's see if it reuses that. Wait for it to run. So base preview, settings, preview name. Based off of reading those docs, I feel like it should run that, but it did not, because it's running through the entire init again. So I'm going to actually cancel this and delete it. And let's make a quick change. So we're going to change the base. And what can the values be? Default, none. Branch. That's for a pull request preview, repo, auto, a preview ID. Okay. So let's go in here. And the preview ID is right in the URL. So we're going to paste that here. Let's run it again. All right. I can actually just follow the build. Made a little helper for myself there. Okay, here we go. Great, so that worked. So as you'll see, this kicked off right away. And it went through a few steps. So, well, it keeps scrolling through. Let's go back to our base preview so you can see what the commands were. Way at the top. So running init commands. And it kicked off right here with, I keep scrolling down, running build commands. So it went straight to build. And that's because we don't have any, update commands. But as you'll see, this went straight from, it copied in all the information from the base preview. And when it ran Xterm got messed up in there. So when it pulled in, you can see that we are on Laravel. It's up to date. When it ran Laravel mix, where's the composer install? See full log. Oh, Laravel mix cleared out the backlog, and that's why it broke. I forgot that this clears it out, but it did composer install, and it actually said that there was nothing to be changed. So it copied over all the installed dependencies. So this built in several seconds, whereas this was like the main build. So that's where you want to have base previews, because now whenever there's a pull request that comes in, it can build off of that and only run it's like a small diff. So it runs a lot faster. That's kind of like the core concept of Tugboat right here. And now we'll get into some more advanced concepts. I'm going to delete some of these, clean it up. And I'm going to remove this base repo part. So now let's dive into something a little bit more advanced, or we could actually try to add we'll come back and add Redis to that. So now we'll go and we're going to look at a Drupal site that has Redis and Solar. So if I go to Drupal extra services, so you gotta just clean up these old folders. So in here we have a very, I would say, traditional Drupal composer build where it's off of recommended project. I've added Redis, Search API, and Search API Solar with Drush, and then php.env. So that way we can read from these env files. I would say this practice is probably not as common in the Drupal community using .env files, and I wish it was more prevalent. I feel like we're just now getting comfortable with environment variables, but really only a handful of platform as a service providers even let you configure environment variables. So the Drupal community is kind of behind in here. We're used to doing like PHP setting file includes. But whenever I work with a Drupal project, I always commit my settings.php, and anything that's sensitive gets put into environment variables. So just as a precursor to getting started here, I want to show this file. So this is a Drupal site with a settings.php. The database is pre-configured to have its host name, database name. The hash salt will be provided in the environment file. And then our deployment identifier will be set. If you don't know about the Drupal deployment identifier, I want to end up making a series about this, but it causes the service container to be invalidated. So if you set it to something that changes on each deploy, Drupal will automatically flush some caches and rebuild the service container if you had this configured properly. I did some research. Platform.sh will set this to be the build tree. Pantheon does something similar, and I think Acquia does as well. So if you are on any of the major like Drupal platform as a service hosts, you're getting this, but you'd want to configure it for your Tugboat as well, which Tugboat has an environment variable called Tugboat preview SHA, and those are documented in their docs as well. All the different environment variables. And that one is right here. And that's the Git SHA that the preview is built from. And then we go in here and I have the Redis configured. This is just copied from the Redis module. So nothing too spectacular there. And the rest is all default Drupal settings. So we'll go ahead and let's build this. So I have that at PHP, Tugboat, Drupal, extra services. And while that builds, okay, let's take a little bit, had me kind of concerned. While that builds, I'll walk through the steps here for how I have a Drupal site built. Again, our services definition, we have the PHP image or PHP service, which is using the 7.4 Apache Docker image. Default true, depends on MySQL. I feel like for most CMSs and that are PHP based, like this is your go-to. In the init command, I enable A2 rewrite. I do add opcache, and I install Redis via Pickle. Pickle. I don't know how you actually pronounce it, but I always say Pickle. And at the same time, you would want to also install APCU for better performance. I don't here because we're on a live stream that I do for 2 hours, and I wanted to try to cut down on extra time. Again, we symlink our doc root to the Apache doc root and ensure that site's default is owned by www, so that way it can manipulate files properly, like uploaded files. And then the update is empty here. This is where we could download files. For example, this is going to actually import a database dump for the Umami demo, but it doesn't have the images. I have a little copy down here that doesn't seem to be working. Really, that should go inside the update where it copies in the files. We copy over the .env tugboat, which I have set up here to just basically have our tugboat configuration preset. Now, you can define environment variables inside Tugboat, so you wouldn't need to always copy these env files. The problem is that you set environment variables for the entire project, so you can add them here. So we could in here say, my SQL database is Tugboat, and it's a build time variable. It's actually just a runtime variable. We can hit save. So it would always be injected. Okay, there it goes. Now it showed up. So it could always be injected, but that means that you have to come in and you have to give somebody access to edit these things. I asked them if it's possible to be able to find them inside the Tugboat YAML. Like what I would want is, ideally what I would want is env, and to be able to just provide some of these inside the definition here, like you do for GitHub Actions, Circle CI, etc. Because that way I wouldn't need to give my dev team access to all of this to be able to manage the settings. But for now, you have to. So for now, to be able to configure those environment variables, you either do it from their CLI, the API, or just copy a .env file. Again, we do composer install, and we're going to run drush updb because we want to run the config schema updates. This is when you would also run config import. And normally, whenever I have a Solar instance, I usually use a config override in settings.php. But we're in a demo and I didn't do a config export. We're going to fix the Solar index to be our Solar host name, and we'll show where that's defined later on in a second rather. Here's where I try to copy the images from the Umami demo into site's default files. This would be not in init, but inside update. And again, I refix our permissions just in case. This is probably not necessary. And then even though I'm against doing a drush cache rebuild on deployments, I have one in here because we're importing a database dump, and we're then connecting to a new instance of Redis. And I've had instances where you get a white screen of death on the first load because the caches aren't populated yet. So on a normal deploy, I don't believe in doing drush cache rebuild. But when you're setting up an initial preview where you copied in a database dump, Redis is unpopulated with cache, you need to run it. So that's the PHP build container. Then we have the MySQL image, as I showed. You do the update, we copy the database dump. And then I learned about zcat. I didn't know that, but when something's gzipped, you can use zcat and not have to gunzip it first, or however you want to say it. And we import it straight to Tugboat and then remove the database dump because we want to reduce our file size. We have the Redis image. Then we also add Solar. So again, this is a Drupal site that has Redis for caching and is using Solar for the search index. We use the init command to ensure that we use the init command to run the Solar create command. And inside the solar image, this is all documented on the official solar Docker image. You run create core, the core name is Drupal, and you have to run it as the solar user. If you try to do it as root, which all these run as root, that's one main thing to know too. Just like in your CI and here, all these operations are done as root. So if you have any file permissions, that's why we're making sure to change the ownership often, just in case there's any write permission errors. So if we go back, oh, we have a failure. Can't CD into, oh, I edited the wrong file somewhere. Second, let me fix this. Sorry, we'll rerun this. And there we go. Let me delete this build. And I'll go through. Yeah, there's nothing too important to go through in this. So let's do a delete. All right, so we'll wait for this to build here. And the nice part is it does show you all the status. And if you get a hold of a preview link, you can actually see this URL here. I know, let's see, lb.cm Olivero. Lullabot has a short code to lb.cm/Olivero. And when you hit a suspended preview, it shows you this nice loading screen that says like, hey, we're waking up the environment. Here's the status on the wake up. So if you do have something which has a lot of services like this, you can watch as everything gets woken up. Failure. Unknown database Tugboat. What? In init, running update, running init. I'm going to change this back to init and run that command again. And I think we might need to update their docs. Let's refresh. Uh-oh. It's going a little bit slow. I don't know if it's me or Tugboat. So I'm going to pause that. Oh, it's sent off. Okay. Boom, 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 boom. All right, so we'll let this build. And I want to go back to that doc, which said, oh, they even have like a full workflow here. So while it's building, we'll just revisit this idea of base previews because that's the core thing. The DB name is always isn't available as an environment variable. That's a good question. I have to wait for this to build to know if that's true. Things are getting weird. Pending, starting, building. Okay, now it's, so I'll see if it is available as an environment variable. As far as I know, it may not. Unknown database. So this was just working. Yesterday and this morning. SQL Tugboat. So let's delete this. I'm going to go to the docs. Import MySQL. So yeah, they even, so here they have it in init, and somewhere else we saw as an update. So I feel like their docs might be a little sharded, which as somebody who has maintained an open source project that has docs, that happens. Yeah, the database should always be called Tugboat. And if we look at their, if we go to reference and we go to Tugboat images and we go to MySQL, it's supposed to jump down. So here, each have a default database named Tugboat, as well as a user and name. In addition, the root database user does not have a password, but may only be used to connect to the database from the MariaDB service. So I'm kicking this back to init. And we're in the extra services one. I'm going to try rerunning this. And let's see. So let's check the status. So I'm really confused because even in the Laravel app, the database is Tugboat. And we ran the migrations and it created the database. Or rather, it created all the files. Sorry, let's actually look at Laravel. So when we just ran Laravel, we have the Tugboat env, which has the Tugboat database and executed all of our migrations, which created the default user tables. So I'm not exactly sure what just happened. So let's see if it goes again. What we can do. All right. So here we're gonna do some debugging because I've had to do this before with my builds. I don't know about anybody else, but it's been extremely frustrating in your CI services if you can't SSH into the containers at their failed state and figure out what went wrong. I know Circle CI provides this, which is why they're one of my preferred CI vendors. I know you can never do that with Travis. You can't do it with GitHub Actions. You can't do it with Bitbucket pipelines. I don't know if you can do it with your GitLab CI at all, but that's like the one feature I like about Circle CI is if it fails, you can rerun with SSH, get into it and see what's going on. So we're going to do the same thing here. So when you view your projects, there's the log and terminal, and then it loads a virtual terminal for you to get into the container. And we're just going to type MySQL and let's do show databases. And there really isn't a Tugboat database. All right. So what we can do is we can ensure that one exists, but I'm really curious now. From this table, you can also click on supported tags to know what tag names are available. And that means you can also view the Docker file. We have this at 5.7. All right. I'm just curious. So it does set that, you're right, it does set it as an environment variable. So we could copy it in, but this environment variable is only inside of that service itself. So we could change it to be MySQL database. Let's try that, but we know that it will be Tugboat. But let's just try running this. And I'm real quick going to just copy this into the Tugboat Slack. So Tugboat does have a Slack for the community and support, and they're super awesome. James is top notch and has helped me with so many problems, which is one reason I just love using Tugboat because like a really fun company and fun service and really cool, great people. So sorry, I can't bring Slack into the main view because I have client stuff in here. Tugboat missing. So that's randomly started to occur. Let's do a delete. I'm going to delete this one, and we're going to try another one real quick. We're going to try something else and see if that works. I was really bummed because I wanted to show the fact that we're integrating Redis and Solar, and we can do it with Laravel, but like it doesn't have as much as an out-of-the-box UI as Drupal does, where it can show that yes, we're communicating to these services. Let's see. Oh, you know what? Shoot. Delete this. I wonder if that's what caused it. Is I added this environment variable. Oh, all right. So that's a good note right here. So I added. Oh, I'm gonna copy that to them real quick too. So that's a false alarm. I added a MySQL database environment variable to the project. So I added a MySQL database environment variable here as a runtime variable, and it broke the build. So I wonder if they need to add something that prevents you from adding like reserved variable words. So let's retry this. And while we watch this run, I'm going to quick file some more information for them. I wonder if there's a way to prevent reserved. So I have no idea how I managed to figure that out. I hope this is it. I just happened to click through and I forgot I even added that environment variable with the idea to replace. Oh, I hope this works. This should work here. With the idea of being able to replace some of the .env files. So you cannot replace those. Otherwise things will break. So it's building. Let's see if we get further along the way. So it curled in the database. And it was successful. Great. And now it's setting up our Solar core. All right. So we're off to the races. That was a fun one. I don't think there would have been any way to figure that out. At least I couldn't have without a good guess. And so what ends up happening, to my understanding, if we can go back to the building a preview, preview deep dive, how do previews work? So my understanding is that regardless if it's the, with no base preview, is we get, it pulls in the Docker image and it processes the config.yaml and it's essentially committing a new Docker file or an image. So normally when you do a full artifact deploy with containers is you have your, we'll say Docker file manifest, and you build it along the way, like you can use the composer or npm and pull things in and get your final build artifact. And that is what you deploy. But the Tugboat, you're deploying a base Docker image, and then you're writing your init, update, and build commands and creating a a final Docker image. And your base preview is like that final Docker image, but you can use the update and build commands to run on incremental builds after that. I believe even in Dockerfile they have there's a run command, and that run command happens in all the child processes. So it's actually a really pretty brilliant architecture. And that's what this workflow here describes, is when you have a base preview, what happens when I click this on the right? So when you have a base preview, you can refresh when you refresh a preview, it runs the update commands. Otherwise, it takes that base and then just runs the build commands. And that's why when we did the Laravel example and ran a refresh, it was so fast, because it didn't have to run the init. It didn't build all the extra dependencies. It even copied over the existing files. So that way it's like running a, like locally when you run composer install or yarn install against a lock file and caches, and it's like, bam, fast. It's the same reasoning here. So let's look at our build. So looks like it's committing now. So when it says committing, that means that it's all wrapped up. So we can see the state here. So now if we go wait for our preview to finish, so it says overall it's building, services are being committed, and we'll log into the Drupal site and show the status of Redis and Solar. So, and then the bigger the image, the longer it takes to commit the final result. So one, like, I was like prepping for this live stream, and originally I was just gonna do everything like off the cuff. Then I realized, like, oh, it involves builds. So if I get anything wrong, that's time wasted, and I want to try to like show as much as I can in this little bit of time. So I tried to get a lot of this prepped last night, actually, and hopefully shareable the best way possible. So like I've said here, like the images are messed up. So here's a great example. Like, let's say you're just configuring Tugboat, and like, I know I downloaded the images. Like, what's going on here? So that's where the terminal comes in handy again. So let's go into websites default. Let's do LSL. So files is owned by www. So let's go to files. LS images. Oh, so when I copied it, because I never know how to write CP to save my life, I always have, like, I never get it right. So CP recursive, I should have done / asterisk, I suppose. I'm going to copy this and CD back, and I'm going to paste it, and let's CD into website. CD into Tugboat root, websites default files. There we go. Well, that's a better fix. And let's do a own. We want to do www data, and we want to do all JPG files. All right. Oh, and PNG. All right, so I was able to quick fix it, and now if I refresh the page, we should get our generated image styles, and the world is a happy, happy place. And so I could manually fix it inside the service and then come back to my VS Code and say, like, all right, well, you don't know how to run CP commands because you forget about the trailing slash and asterisk. Now we're all good to go. So on the next build, it'll be honky-dory. And like, oh, CI projects, I hate the make one line change, commit, push, see what happens. By having with Tugboat and the CLI access, you can just try things and see if it works and not have to worry about making 5,000 commits to see if you finally got the build just right. So we're going to log into this now. So for those who don't know, Drupal has, it's called the Umami demo. It's a food magazine. I chose it because it's a lot better than a empty site. I made the password be admin admin in my database dump. Yes, I am sure that is a breached password. So first I'm going to go to reports. Status report. Why isn't Redis installed? All right. Let's install the Redis module. Now, the Redis module is not one that you typically install. Like you just have the code available and then you load its classes dynamically, or well, you register its classes automatically itself. Oh, translation is not configured. So, but if we go to reports, when you enable it, you get some cool information here. First, we'll go back to the status report and we'll see Redis is connected using the PHP Redis client, which is the PHP extension for Redis. And you'll see here we're connected. We've got the version, how many keys, keys per bin, and the most render cache entries with most variations. So this is actually a really interesting page. If you've never gone to it, you can see things that have the highest cache cardinality, like what is bloating your cache, and like what's invalidated the most, and time spent with a few things. So great, we have Redis working, which means that the site is zippy and everybody's happy. Now let's go fix our Solr because that was throwing an error. So we're going to go to configuration and search API. Oh, never mind. It's working. Solr path core. Why would something threw an error before? Let's go back. If we view it, incomplete Solr schema, the search API Solr module changed how it works a bit. So now we can see the host name is based off of the name we gave here. So if you use Docker Compose, it's the same thing. I'm sure it's like when you add attached services in Circle CI or Bitbucket pipelines, it's the same. It's the same concept. GitLab CI. I think GitHub Actions is the only one that doesn't let you mount like side services. But this is the host name. So when we configured Redis, we said Redis was the host name, Solr. Same with MySQL. So we're able to go here. And if we wanted to, we could go back. Index. It says it has 36 things indexed. Bet we could go to Solr. If we go to Solr admin, reload core. Oh, I was hoping maybe it would show, let us browse things. But so we're able to get Solr running in here. And let me just create a view to prove that we're getting data from Solr. So if we did search, let's do it index default. And we'll do save and edit. The index might be broken because it assumes you have the standard install. Yeah. Well, it's not perfect because it is just a demo, but that's how you can get Solr configured to be indexing everything with Tugboat. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this. Oh, that opens the repo. And the next one we're going to go through is actually a decoupled Drupal setup. So I have so it depends on how you have your decoupled setup running. Typically when I do a decoupled project build, I have two different repositories. My front end repo and then my back end repo are on their own. But for this example, I have it set up as a mono repo because that way you can have previews in the same of the same repository. And this may not be like a common use case, but I wanted to show doing a more complex Tugboat build. Like if you had a site with microservices and everything. They get a mono repo of microservices. I'm not sure. But I thought figured it'd be an interesting use case. So my app is a React app with an environment variable. Oh, I committed that. Did not mean to. But it has in its .env.tugboat. So when you use create React app, environment variables have to be prefixed with React underscore app. Otherwise, they won't be read to avoid environment variable pollution or something getting snuck in. So we're actually doing a pass through where we take the Tugboat default service URL. Remember here, when we went through that, there is a default service, and this is PHP. So we're telling the front end that the API URL is the URL to the default service. And I have a little component in here that fetches the JSON API entry point. And then our Drupal site is basically like the last one, just with no dependencies. Again, it has a .env file to be able to configure the host name for the database. So let's go ahead and kick off that build. Do decoupled Drupal. And while that gets kicked off, I'll walk through the configuration. So I had a few different ideas here. And at first I was way too complicated with it. I was going to create a default service that was built with traffic, however you pronounce it, and use it as like a proxy to bounce between the two other services. And then I read the Tugboat documentation and realized that I was over engineering, as I often do. So with Tugboat, if you have multiple services and there's one default, but there's like side services, such as what if in Tugboat we want to expose the Solar admin URL, or you have a mono repo with like 4 different node projects because they're microservices. However, you can attach this expose key and it will expose that port. So it's also helpful if you run on a non-standard port. Let's say that your project by default runs on 8080 because in your infrastructure, your load balancer maps 80 to 8080 and you don't want to adjust your config. So you say, hey, expose 8080, and when you go to the URL, Tugboat will do that routing for you. And that's what that node is here. When a service is set as default port 80, when it's set as default, it automatically gets exposed with port 80. You could use expose to change that default port. So I was thinking about going all kinds of extra on this. You can define aliases so that way you can have multiple subdomains point to the same service. So I was going to have app and API point to like a proxy that then routed to the other services, and realized I don't need to do that. I'm able to just say that like this expose 80 is actually not needed anymore. So I just say that my Drupal backend is the default service and it has a lot of the same things as before. And while I'm here, I'm going to fix that. And then I also have a front end, which I just realized I have these both set to true. Wait a second. That shouldn't work. Or rather, this build won't work. So I have Drupal set to be checkout true. This is another command here where if we define a default service, sorry, I need to find how to set up services. Name your service. There's define. Oh, clone. So when you specify the default, so when something has default true, as we'll see here, it automatically checks out the code into that service and exposes a port. Otherwise, you need to specify checkout true to clone the repository into that service. Tugboat does not have a concept of volumes, so it does not share volumes between the different services, which is one reason why we don't have like a PHP FPM setup, because there isn't a way to share uploaded code or uploaded files rather. So let's see how this build is going. So we have, and then we have our front end, which is just using HD like Apache, and it installs Node again, adds yarn, and then we build our repo, or build our JavaScript rather, using just yarn install, copy the env file, run build, link our doc root. Now this isn't good enough for a single page app. You'd have to adjust the Apache config somehow. I haven't gotten to that point to seeing how you would run that. There are examples inside of, they do have some starter configs, and maybe that is one that would be in here. You know, they have one for Ruby on Rails, which that has the start. Let's look at the Jekyll static site. No, Hugo. So they have it for static sites, but they don't have one for single page apps. And that's where I would like to help document this in the examples once I get the single page app part working here. And then we have the MySQL database, which, as we've seen, is pretty straightforward. You download the database, zcat it in, and then remove it. I want to see where this build's at. We're now installing opcache. So one thing that I was told is default URL, environment variables. So if we go to the environment variables and default, if I could type, oh, because it's default service URL. So all services have these environment variables. Every service knows of the default service. So that means that right now, if we have the front end set to true, or sorry, the front end is set to default, inside the Drupal service container, if we export this environment variable, we'll have the URL to the front end. So to get decoupled Drupal to work, or decoupled application, you actually need to have the backend API be the default service. So that way the front end can read the environment variable and know how to talk to it dynamically. There's actually another way that it could be worked around, but I want to go through making this work correctly before we go that far. So there's actually like a lot of handful of nice items in here, like this Tugboat default service token. Inside the tricks, I'll go through the tricks right now. So one way that you could actually find the URL is by making a curl request against the API and looking through the services using JQ, which is like a JSON query, a way to parse JSON and perform a query, where we could find the PHP service and dynamically get the URL. But the cool part here is this Tugboat default service token means that you can make API calls from within your service to Tugboat, and perform actions to be self-aware, if you will. Like if there's things you need to look up from other services, you can do all that based off the service token. And you'll see here you've got like the preview ID, so you know your preview ID and the project ID. So if you needed to do any kind of extra setup inside of your preview environment based off other services, you could dynamically do that. But I like to try to take the easier approach first, which would be, let's do the preview here real quick. The easier way would be having the backend be the default service URL, and then all the front ends reading that variable and pointing to it. All right, so we have our backend, and if I go to /JSON API, we have the JSON API entry point for Drupal. And if I go to the front end, I'm going to open DevTools, and we'll see that we got a 404 because it copied in the old React URL. So I want to quick go to terminal. So ls. So if we lsa, so we'll see we have cat env and cat env.local. I want to quick see what. So as you'll see, it's actually referencing itself. So that's why we need to flip it around a little bit. So let's destroy this preview. We're going to delete. And let's change this. So this should not be default. This should just be checkout. And then this should be default. And again, all services know the default service URL, which in this case is going to be Drupal. So that way the front end knows how to query the API and know the host name. So let's go ahead and resend this. One thing I didn't add here, so I do have this polling. I want to show off some neat things about their API. So when it posts a preview, we get back the response, which is the URL that has the preview ID. We also get the job ID. And you can fetch information about the job, and it returns back a retry after header, which I think is hard coded to 10 seconds. It basically says, hey, after 10 seconds, you can query me again. And what you could do is actually fetch the logs. And that's what we do for the Simply Test Me site is it's not really streaming inside of Tugboat. They actually use a WebSocket for streaming, but we just make multiple requests. So you can actually get the logs as this is happening and print them in a status somewhere. So you could build your own UI to Tugboat. That way, they can fit into your, your support team's dashboard if you wanted to. You could really get pretty robust with this tooling. When you do have pull requests set up, you can configure how the pull requests work, where you can have it build pull requests automatically, rebuild them automatically. It can set the pull request status, which is nice. So it will show like the deployment status, deployment status. So I would set up the trigger to log these as deployments. So it actually shows when something's in progress. So when it starts to build, it pings GitHub, and then when it's done, it pings GitHub that's been successful or failed. I also have it post the preview links as comments, and rebuild, or there's just some really cool settings. Oh, refresh base preview. We turned this off because we have a script that first dumps the database. So we could actually just drop our script and just make sure that this is configured to run before our script. But, developers be developers and write tools that they don't need to always write. If you need to add a deploy key, you can add this so that way you can copy in like private repositories that might be in your Composer build. So let's go back and see how this build is doing. This one takes a while just because of the installing the npm dependencies is just a bear. And if this seems slow, remember I'm on a free plan right now. This project is on a free plan. If I go to demos, if I go to project settings, so it's only at half of a virtual CPU with 2 gigs of build time RAM. I have it at my clients, like I said, I have at the intro, which is 1 virtual CPU and 2 gig. Well, it's still 2 gigs of build time RAM, but the CPU time is what you need. So with the 29, it's a lot faster. Obviously, if you're on the 99, it'd be pretty fast, but I wasn't going to pay for just this quick demo. So this is now still creating the optimized build. Man, if we thought Composer was slow with Composer 1, this is taking the cake right here. So while this is going, is there any questions from anybody else about Tugboat or Tugboat configurations? Anything I might have covered but went over a bit too fast? Um, so while that's going, one thing I want to try to work on is getting a Drupal and Nginx Drupal or Nginx with PHP FPM setup. Um, I'm starting to think it might be more difficult than I thought. Um, but one thing I at least wanted to try is while reviewing the Tugboat. Here, I'll go back. Here, actually, I'll answer this question before I go into a whole side tangent. Tugboat with GitHub PRs. Yes, I just mentioned that, and that's fine. So I do use GitHub. I use Tugboat with my GitHub PRs. Earlier in the stream, I brought up how I leverage with Tugboat. We send our client the preview URL, and they approve it, and we basically merge the PR and then ship it out to production. So that's why we use Tugboat, because I don't believe in merging to develop without having it be QA'd in a preview environment so you know it's clean. That is like my biggest pet peeve when it's like, yeah, we'll merge to dev and then test it on a QA server, because you can't release to production that way because you have a dirty dev branch. But that's that's a meism. I like to deploy like 6 times a day if I can. Tugboat, I have with the pull request. If you go into project settings, it's a project level setting. No, it's not. It's a repo level setting. So in Tugboat, you have projects and then you have multiple repos in the project. So if we go to repository setting, we can actually set up a pull request deployment status, build on pull requests. They have all these settings. I will have it comment on somewhere. It says, set deployment. Post the links as pull request comments, so that way they're more easily available for clicking. And this works just like it shows up as like not quite a status. Maybe it shows up as a status check. I have it set up as a deployment status. Goes in. Maybe we can. You know what? Let me do one thing real quick, and we'll test it out. So for this exact reason, I double cloned my environment here. Well, you shouldn't have to reinstall Drupal every time. So it depends on how your setup is. Now, I know I sometimes get, so one second. I think I know what you mean, where if you have, it depends on how you have it configured. So I relate to that because on platform.sh, when we have the hosting there and use the preview environments for that, whenever a pull request received a commit, only to reinstall a new module. Okay. An example that I had a problem with is platform.sh has a setting that when you update a pull request, it would synchronize the production, and it would synchronize the parent database into the pull request on each commit, which is cool to get a clean slate, unless somebody entered a bunch of content for testing and then all the content was lost. So that's a big bummer. But with Tugboat, you don't have that problem because you would import the initial database on initialization. So that means that your base preview would already have the database imported, and your pull request would only run the build and update, the build commands, or the update command as well to synchronize the data. So in this example, to reinstall a new module, so if it was added in the pull request, they should have updated your sorry. If it's a Drupal site and they added a new module, inside your build commands, you have drush updb to run the update schema changes, but then you have CIM for config import. You shouldn't have to worry about that being reset, or if a new commit comes in, only these build commands should run, so you should have no regressions or manual work. I actually, surprisingly, for doing Drupal for the past 7 years, all of my Tugboat stuff is currently Laravel and JavaScript. Um, I haven't had the opportunity to put a Drupal site on this yet, which is probably why so many of the demos are Drupal focused, because I haven't had a chance to really play with that yet. Does that help answer the question? Like, or provide any clarity or examples on how we have it set up? Let's see, give that a second. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I would play with the settings, because it sounds like if there is some struggles and woes, why the if there's some struggles and woes, there might be some more configuration options needed. Apparently I forgot to set the expose on the front end. No, don't clone it. Shoot. Yes, delete this preview. And if you delete the preview, it will delete the clone, or not. So that's one cool thing too. If you do have a preview that's configured, you can clone it. So that way you can just immediately have a replica of it. So if you need people to work on 2 different versions of it to try some things out, there you go. Yeah, it also depends on the nature of the site. Definitely. Everybody has their own different workflows. Let's see. I need to change this to be expose 80. Yeah, because we're on Apache. So we'll rebuild that. One thing I've never tested is if you have a base preview, but then modify the image or the checkout or the expose, and it tries to use a base preview, does it just skip the base preview, or are those ignored until it gets merged in? That's something I'm not sure about. But what could be useful if you do have environments where there's like testing content being added and you're worried about the pull request environment being blown away by an update, I would clone. So once it's built and you know that this is more of like a manual operation, and that's where maybe integrating the API could be useful. So this clone a preview. So if you have these instances where somebody creates a PR, but then when the PR gets new commits added, it resets the environment in some way or form, such as a config import. Drupal's config system is great until you modify the config, and then it gets re-imported and you lose your config. So in your case, you might want to come in and go to actions and manually clone the pull request, or set up like some kind of API that on what you could do. Because since I know you said you joined in late, so I'm not sure what you caught or did not catch. What you could do is on build, let's copy this tricks thing. So inside all the services, there is this, let's see, let me just expand this. There is the default service token, and that is an access token to the API that's inside the environment. So you could do a curl, and we would want to do a X post, and because it's a post to clone, right? So previews ID clone, we got previews ID clone, path parameters, request body schema expires, and name. If not, it'll begin the same label as the preview was cloned from. So what you could try doing is adding this line in here, and I'm gonna make a comment example of creating a clone. Now, this actually could be dangerous. I wonder if it would start causing almost like a recursive action. Not recursive, that's not the right way to put it, but like after the clone is built, then this would be built, and so on and so forth. So maybe this isn't a great idea, but you could run this somehow. Some way you could choose to run this with the Tugboat default service token. Let's see, this is building. So while we check that, what I want to see is if we could work around that problem. So that way you could have this conditionally in here or as a separate GitHub action, maybe. No, because you wouldn't have the service token. So default service, this is about the service. This is about the preview, ID of the current preview, the reference, the type. It'll be a value of branch, tag, commit, pull request, or merge request. So if you're in GitLab, I'm assuming that's where merge request comes in. The project ID, the system root, the service ID, and the host name for the Tugboat SMTP server. So you can capture outbound emails via SMTP. I've yet to play around with this. It's been one of a few of my projects I'm on have been, this is we need a test email, but we've just been doing it with MailHog locally, and we want to eventually get it into Tugboat. So I have not yet tested the SMTP feature. Expose service variables, base preview, environment variables. It was built from a base preview. So to get on this topic here, I wonder if when you clone, it has a base preview. Did you check to prevent continuous copies? Something like that might be possible. You could get creative with it. While we wait for that to build, let's look up the SMTP functionality. SMTP, captured mail. So I don't know how you read it, or I don't know how you access the email actually. So if you're using a Tugboat provided image, outgoing email generated within your preview should forward to their SMTP proxy. Captures all that outgoing mail and displays it in captured mail when you click into a preview. So, captured mail, it's right here. It was right in front of my face the entire time. So if you send email, something should get captured. And we'll try that out to see if it shows up. Tugboat makes the best effort. Commonly used SMTP ports 25. Oh, sweet. So any mail sent through is captured to display. So it actually tries to even catch outgoing on those ports without you configuring it. So I'm used to having to configure something and point it to that host name, but it sounds like they try to even intercept it itself. If you're using PHP and you don't have it configured and it's going to send a mail, that's rerouted to their SMTP as well. So we'll give that a shot and try that out once this finishes building. That's a typo. I can't spell continuous at all. All right, so committing. Again, the bigger the images, the longer it takes to commit. I'm going to open these previews up so they'll reload once it's ready. I do suggest that you read on the preview deep dive, especially optimizing preview builds. I need to go through this myself as well, because you pay for your size and time, and this whole contact Tugboat support for optimizing your config. So I brought up, James has been spectacular at helping me optimize this. When I was running the Laravel app for the first time, I hit like weird little problems. So that was invaluable for help. And also, like, I just don't know of any other product that's like this. Like I said, I'm used to it being built into platform.sh, which made me always feel like I had to use platform.sh for hosting. I mean, they're still my favorite host. But once I got handed a few projects that are on AWS, I was like, am I gonna have to build out dynamic preview environments myself? Like, I know people have done it, but I wasn't looking forward to it. So being able to just pay $30 a month for a project and plug it into Tugboat, I'm cool with it. And even then, I'm probably overpaying because I pay per project instead of like putting all my repos into one project. But It's because I really like Tugboat, and I don't mind paying if it helps ensure that they keep being a company and making my life easier. So if you did have to try to save costs, I guess you could put multiple repos in one project, because it's per project billing. This is taking a minute to commit. And again, this is why you want to do a base preview, because then this wouldn't take so long every single time. Which, again, this is why we upgrade the tier, so that way this can be faster. Because all I want to do is try out this email, this captured mail, so that way we can preview it. It is neat, the preview statistics, the average build time, average refresh time. So you go into it, it tells you the build size. You know, I wonder if, I actually don't know what happens if you create a preview that's too big for your size limit. And I have a feeling this one might be getting close to there. So maybe that's why this is hanging. I'm going to try one thing quick. I can't get to the terminal. Wonder if we could do, if I delete node modules, and if that's one reason it's hanging. Oh, I know this built this morning. Well, it built earlier too. So why is this hanging so long? I'm going to kick off another preview real quick off of the, I don't need to check the preview status there anymore. Let's kick off this preview again, so we can test out the emails. Because I got about like 30 minutes left, and I at least want to check that out. And hopefully this commits, so we can see what happens there. So as I said, preview log. So this returns a log and it streams all the status. Actually, what's really cool is if I open DevTools here and we open the network tab and we go to WebSockets, let me refresh it. So you got the WebSocket and you can see all the messages it passes back and forth as it gets started. So in here, it's streaming and we've got all the data that's coming through. And there we go. So there's the log, so we can start to see the log messages. So when you call that, oh, cool, finished building. When you call that one API endpoint, it will return all the time logs that have been running. Okay, so that built, that just took a while to commit. This still is pulling the wrong URL. Oh, no, it's not. It just didn't run. Oh, there it is. There we go. It's just styled all wrong. So as you can see, it's reading from the .env file, which I know went through a few different things since we first looked at this. Oh, I checked out the other branch. So in decoupled Drupal, you'll see the env Tugboat. It's replacing React app API URL with the default service URL, which means that we're able to dynamically connect to our backend server and get the JSON API endpoint from this web service right here. So if you do have a decoupled Drupal setup with a mono repo where the front-end app and the back-end app are in the same repository, you could do a conjoined Tugboat preview with both of those. Again, I don't normally have my decoupled apps work that way, but it is possible. Let's test out this email thing. All right, so let's go to login. I'm going to reset my password. Username is admin. If admin is a valid account, it'll be sent to your blah, blah, blah. Sweet. So we've got the subject here. What happens when I click on it? And we get the email sent. So I don't have, it'd be really cool to try this with Swift Mailer configured. So you have HTML emails. If we view the source, oh, this is amazing. It's like having mail hog on in your preview. I definitely could have used this a long time ago because primarily I work in e-commerce, as one of the maintainers of Drupal Commerce. So testing emails like order receipts is huge. And man, this is killer. I can't wait to start leveraging this more. We have a project that sends out weekly emails, and we just made sure it never sent an email in Tugboat. Now we could actually start working on theming those a lot better. So that's really cool. You can download it, which I don't know if anybody's ever had fun just downloading if you download an email file, it's not spectacular. It just looks like this. It's the raw source. So you could test like if you have HTML and plain text that it's sending both separated properly. Cool. And then if I hit delete, that's really awesome. I'm pretty excited about that and to try it out some more. Yeah. So I hope that helped explain Tugboat to folks a bit and that you're just excited about their service as I am. I planned on doing this before they offered to help sponsor the live stream. Once I told them about it, they're like, hey, we'll help sponsor. I'm like, great. I just wanted to show it off because I think it's a really cool tool. And one of my main things is I like seeing developer acceleration. I know we talk about velocity all the time, right? Velocity means that you're just keeping pace. But I believe in developer acceleration, and Tugboat is one of those tools that you don't just keep the status quo. It allows you to move faster, build more confidently. On our Laravel app, we have PHP unit integrated with PHP units testing all of our controllers. We have PHP stand to catch any bugs. And then we have our Tugboat environments that let us manually preview things. If the NPM build fails, if Tugboat fails on building the JavaScript, well, now we know we have a bug in our JavaScript. If we know our test pass, great, we can just send off the link to our client and say, hey, does this look okay? Is this what you're expecting? Being agile is all about taking minimal requirements, building something, and then getting feedback. Tugboat enables us to do that at a really fast speed. So it's really great. I hope this helps show off a lot of the features. I'm sure there's things that I have missed in this. Like at least we went through the SMTP. There is a CLI available. So if you don't want to be like me and, write a PHP script that calls the API, they do have a CLI for doing a few of the different things and monitoring items. There's that. They do have some example starter configs as I showed out. I would like to take some of my examples and make them into proper starter configs instead of this mono repo thing I developed. So that way we can show not just Drupal 9, but Drupal 9 with a decoupled front end. They do have examples for webhook integration. So that way when something's built, you can say, hey, this is the URL for it. I actually have this set up on all of my deployments. Whenever a deployment goes out, I don't have it for Slack or for Tugboat. One thing that they do provide is one of the initial features I remember everybody talking about Tugboat with was visual diffs to do visual regression testing. So it's available on Plus and Premium, which is... so that's why I didn't try it yet, because I'm on intro. So This is worth it, in my opinion. If you have something like, I would like to upgrade one of my clients to this once we actually get that project stable enough again. An example, if you've never done visual diff testing, let me see if they have good examples. So you do a preview, visual diffs. So it will actually take screenshots of the page from a before and after and tell you what has changed. 7 years ago, I became a believer in visual diff testing. This is like right when it became a thing. Like BBC had just released Wraith, which I don't know if anybody even uses Wraith anymore for visual testing regression. At that time, we built a web hosting platform on Drupal. It was like 500 sites built on a Panoply distro on Eager, and we were getting ready to do a release. And my boss, the CTO, is like, it's 5 p.m. here, 3 p.m. his time. He's like, guys, there's a bug on the site. And he sent us the link. He's like, what do you see wrong? It was of like a preview environment for them. And like panicking because I was like project lead. And I'm like, I don't know what's wrong with it. And he changed the CSS ever so slightly. And it was something that we couldn't catch. But when we loaded it in a visual regression test, it was all kinds of scattered. He like removed some padding. Something that like I didn't know. And just that many panic attack of thinking like, it's 5 p.m. I want to get dinner. Something's wrong. It showed the huge importance of the visual diff. You know, some people might be like, well, that's mean. It was all in good fun. He let us panic for about 10 minutes and then explained, this is why we're adding this to our workflow. And we did. We made visual regression testing be part of our workflow immediately after that. And having Tugboat streamline that is really, really awesome. And it looks like when you add this, it also gives you part of the Lighthouse reports, which Lighthouse is a, if you remember using page speed from Google, like think of Lighthouse as that at the next level with best practices and some accessibility built into it. You can read more about it there. I'm sorry, when I say there, I mean on the Google tools for developers. Just go on Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo and type in Lighthouse, and you'll see it come up. Provides a lot of cool tools, performance, accessibility, some best practices, and having this integrated to Lighthouse is giving you like a secondary CI. So you could use GitHub Actions, Bitbucket, Circle CI, whatever, for your unit test, your build test, all that, and then have Tugboat provide your visual regression testing along with your live previews. So it's extremely useful, extremely powerful, especially if you have a large project with a small team. You know, my teams, I have myself and a few subcontractors that I'm working with. And, you know, we move fast, we have big projects, and this is how we're able to do it, by just being really smart with the tools at hand. And Tugboat lets us do that. So thanks for tuning in and checking out all the cool things about Tugboat and some of the experiments with getting it working. I hope you found it useful and you can find use for it. And again, if you need any help with Tugboat, let's see, Slack support. So if you're curious or have any questions, go to docs.tugboat.qa/support. I'm sure they might have this on their website, but you can join their Slack channel and chat with them, and they can help you be like, is this right for me? And work through any of those quirks. You know, this morning I shared this tricks. James gave me this trick this morning. I was like, hey, can you just review some of the stuff I'm going to go over? He's like, oh, here's a really cool way that you could get the URL. Awesome. Like, I didn't leverage it in this case because I found a more simpler approach, but now I know a new little tip. So there we go. Thanks for joining in. Next week, I need to look at my calendar real quick to figure out what I'm talking about to make sure I don't get it wrong. Fridays, I'm doing this thing called Hack and Play, where every Friday I'm closing out the week and the day by just working on something new and showing off a few things and experimenting. On the 21st, so next week, I'm actually going to be setting up a Drupal commerce site and showing how to sell files, because my wife recently started becoming a home baker, selling cookies. So we bought that 3D printer and I make her cookie cutters. But maybe I want to start selling my STL files that you feed in, and I could sell those using Drupal Commerce with file access. So on the 21st, I'm going to walk through that. If you're curious, follow this channel and tune in. So thanks for joining in. Everybody have a great weekend. Bye.